And so it is with this discourse that we're going to be looking at this morning, in which Jesus is going to be talking about time, especially about the future. And parts of this, in this Olivet Discourse, that is, it's been known to be called, parts of it has to do with the disciples' future, whereas some other parts of it has to deal with our future. And so it's going to be confusing. Just like sitting down, watching a time-traveling movie with me, I'll be sitting there scratching my head going, what? I don't know what's going on. You might feel that way this morning, and that's okay. Because like I said in my prayer, Mark 13, or what we call the Olivet Discourse, is one of the more challenging passages in the entire Bible. There's been a great deal of debate as to what Jesus meant when He elaborated on these things. And I'm going to share my position with you this morning, and I'm just going to admit to you, this is not a perfect position. This is not a position that has no difficulties. In fact, when we're done with this, you might even sit there and go, well, did you ever consider this? And I'll tell you that I have, but I'm still stumped over a lot of things. And so we're going to be talking about Jesus and what He had to say about the future. And again, like I've already said, portions of this is not our future, but is the disciples' future, whereas other portions of it is our future. And that's the trick, trying to figure out when is Jesus talking to the disciples exclusively, or when is He talking to everybody in general, okay? So there's a lot of debate about this passage, and there's a lot of debates about the end times. I already did a class on the end times in my Sunday evenings. You're free to go to YouTube and watch those if you want to know what I have to say about all the various kinds of positions, because I'm not going to be talking about things like Antichrist. I'm not going to be talking about things like the rapture or anything like that this morning. I want to try my best to stick to the text. But here's the great thing. All Christians agree on the fact that Jesus Christ is going to return. And that wonderful truth should instill in our hearts a great deal of joy. Because all the heartache that we experience now and will experience until we rest in the grave will be fixed when Jesus Christ returns. Ray Ortlund Jr., he put it this way: Jesus will not come back to tweak this problem and that. He will return with a massive correction of all systemic evil forever. And all of God's people say, amen. That's what we want. The return of Jesus is something I meditate on a regular basis and just long for, I want, I desire. This is not some morbid fascination with the end of my life, but rather a healthy fascination of the beginning of my true life in Jesus when He returns and makes all things new. And so Jesus does have a great deal to say about the future and the return of Himself. And I know a lot of people think about the end times and say, I don't want to talk about that at all. I don't like this, blah, blah, blah. Well, then you're just going to have to ignore much of what Jesus had to say. Because, like I said, the Olivet Discourse is primarily about the future. And the Olivet Discourse is found in all of the Synoptic Gospels. It's found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, of course, and Luke 21. And so Jesus does talk about the end times. So if you're someone who says, I don't want to talk about the end times, that means there's portions of Jesus' teachings that you want to ignore. And you can't do that. Okay? So I want to try my best to answer the question, how does one interpret what Jesus has to say in Mark 13? Like I said, I didn't read the entire thing for you, but go ahead later on, or even right now, read its entirety for yourself and see if what I say aligns with what Jesus says. So the way that I interpret this passage is I allow the questions of the disciples frame the conversation. And basically, when you look at Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13, the basic gist of their questions goes like this, and there's two of them. Number one, what signs will precede the destruction of the Jewish temple? And number two, what signs will precede your coming? And by coming, I mean your second coming, your parousia, the great appearance of Jesus Christ. What signs should we look for to anticipate that? Now, going back to the first question, what signs will precede the destruction of the Jewish temple? In my experience, pastors and preachers give very little attention to the theological significance of the temple's destruction. In fact, I would dare say there might be people in this room who didn't know that the temple was even destroyed or didn't know what Jesus had to say about it. But everything, remember how I talked about once, Jesus entered in Jerusalem and he seems to be running hot, real angry, right? Well, everything's kind of leading up to this moment in which he finally pronounces what he intends to do with this corrupt religious system and their corrupt temple. If you go and read Matthew chapter 23, he spends the whole chapter just lamenting about the wicked religious leaders, and then it concludes with him lamenting over Jerusalem, say how I long to gather you to myself in a way that a mother hen would her chicks, but you are not willing. And then he says this, then I'm going to leave your house desolate to you, and it will not return. Things will not be well for you until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then after he has chastised the religious system, he goes into this lament about how he's going to destroy their house. And in Matthew 24, Mark 13, as they're walking through the Jewish temple, the disciples say, have you not considered the beauty of this temple? Look at it, Jesus. Isn't it remarkable? And so that's when he says, I'm going to tell you something. And just to paraphrase him, this temple is going to be destroyed. That's what prompts the Olivet Discourse. That very statement of Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple is why he brings up the end times anyway. And so a lot of people want to overlook what Jesus has to say about the temple and jump right to the very end. And I would argue that is an abuse of the text. I would argue that most of what he says in Mark 13 has to do with signs preceding the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. So again, I say this, pastors and preachers give little attention to the theological significance of the temple's destruction. Because what is clearly illustrated by its destruction is the end of an age. The Old Covenant and its emphasis on temple worship, priesthood, and sacrificial system has concluded. This may not mean much to us as modern-day Kentuckians because we've never seen the temple. We never visited the temple. We never sacrificed in the temple. It never was the locus of our society. But I want to tell you, what Jesus is saying is shocking to first century Jews. In fact, when he was on trial, that was one of the accusations they brought against him. He's threatening to destroy the temple. So again, this narrative about temple destruction does not need to be overlooked. The destruction of the temple marks the end of the Old Covenant. So the author of Hebrews anticipated the end of the Old Covenant. Now let me stop right there. This is something that a lot of people struggle with when interpreting the Bible, is that sometimes they think that the Old Covenant ends with Malachi, because that's the last book in the Old Covenant, and that the New Covenant begins in the Gospel of Matthew, that there's a clear dividing line between the two. But that is not the case. Jesus introduced the New Covenant while the Old Covenant still existed but was slowly passing away. And so when you read the letters of Paul, when you read the general letters, when you read the book of Acts, the Old Covenant is still in effect, but it is slowly dying away. The author of Hebrews puts it this way. He says in Hebrews 8:13, by saying a new covenant, he has declared that the first is obsolete. And what is obsolete is growing old and is about to pass away. It hasn't yet. It's slowly dying and going away. What event are they anticipating to see the end of the Old Covenant and finally see it die? The destruction of the temple. And that's what the author of Hebrews is trying to convince his audience. He's trying to convince us, a bunch of Jews, don't go back to the old covenant. It's going away. What can be shaken will be shaken. And so the old covenant was shaken spiritually and literally, introducing the new covenant. And so there's no point of trying to hide out in the old covenant if it's going away. So the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the theological significance of that is it gives us a clear marker in history as to when the old covenant finally died. And that was in AD 70. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple occurred in AD 70. Now, after this prediction where Jesus says not one of these stones are going to lay on top of one another, and he was right, by the way, he informs them that there are signs to look for so as to be prepared for that day. They are as follows, and this is where a lot of people get this wrong. A lot of people read these signs and think that these are the signs Jesus gives to prepare people for His second coming. He hasn't even brought that up yet. He's still on the subject of the destruction of the temple. They're asking questions about that. And here is what he says. In verses 9 through 13, you can glean over that as I say this. They will experience various forms of persecution. And boy, did the early church experience various forms of persecution. Being brought before governors, being dragged into synagogues, beaten in the streets, hated by the whole world. Even as they went outside of Israel, you can go and read Paul's letters talking about all the difficulties that the apostles endured. Now here's the thing. If the Christian motif is that we're always going to suffer, then what does that have to do with us? Who here has suffered for the name of Jesus? Significantly suffered in the way that Jesus just described in verses 9 through 13? Me neither. Me neither. And so that passage, therefore, doesn't seem to be relevant to us, does it? And again, we are quick to dismiss to whom Jesus was originally speaking to, right? We want to sit there and say, what does this passage mean to us? We didn't ask the questions. It was the disciples who asked the questions. And so he warns them, before this destruction occurs, you're going to be persecuted. You're going to have a hard time. Not only that, in verses 14 through 20, he mentions the abomination of desolation. Now he's using Jewish lingo right there. They knew exactly what Jesus was talking about when referring to the abomination of desolation. Now the abomination of desolation was predicted in the book of Daniel, and we see an event that happened in 168 BC underneath Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was a Greek man who entered into the Jewish temple during the intertestamental period between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. He walked into the Holy of Holies and he erected a statue of Zeus and he slaughtered a pig right there in their most sacred space. And that resulted in the Jewish revolt that we call the Maccabean revolt. And you can read the Apocrypha if you want. Portions of that talk about that. And again, you can look at Jewish history and see that that happened. But that occurred around 168 BC. And the Jews of that day considered that to be the abomination of desolation. When Antiochus IV Epiphanes walked into their temple and desecrated it. Jesus is sitting there saying, something like that's going to happen again. And did that happen in their lifetime? And the answer is yes. When the Romans came in and ransacked Jerusalem, one of the generals, I believe his name was Titus, also entered into their sacred area, decimated it, and drug out all their gold and, of course, destroyed the temple. And Jesus is telling them, listen, things are going to get intense, things are going to get worse, there's going to be persecution, and then there's going to be this abomination of desolation. And he says, and when you see that, you run. You run. Who's he talking to? The Jews of that day. That's why he says, pray it doesn't happen on the Sabbath. What's that have to do with you and me? Pray you're not pregnant. Pray it doesn't happen in the winter. Because that's when it really gets bad. 21 through 23 tells us another sign is false messiahs. There's always false messiahs. But they were very predominant during that day. And I think that was the cleverness of Satan trying to overshadow the true Messiah. I'm going to send a bunch of Messiahs so that the one true Messiah is overlooked. And then verses 24 through 27, it talks about the Son of Man coming in judgment. Now again, this is where there's a little debate between me and other positions. Some folks say, well, that's in reference to His second coming in judgment. I would argue it's in reference to His coming in judgment when He destroys the Jewish temple. See, a lot of the times when the Bible uses the phrase, the day of the Lord, talking about judgment, it's not always talking about the end times. Sometimes it's talking about some judgment that's going to occur within human history. And Jesus even told them, right? He told the Pharisees when they were on trial, they said, "Are you the Messiah?" And He said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming on a cloud of glory and coming in." And so they ripped their robe. Now He said, "You will see." You. Now who's He talking to? The Pharisees. You're going to bear witness to what I'm talking about. And by the way, in Revelation you see that too. All the tribes who pierced Him will see Him. See, we tend to think that Revelation is strictly future too. But I digress. And so, all of these signs will occur prior to the destruction of the temple. In the same way, a careful observer can look at a fig tree to decipher the season, and you see Jesus in 28 talks about the parable of the fig tree. In the same way that a careful observer can look at a fig tree to decipher the season, the disciples can decipher the approaching destruction of Jerusalem. Now this, my position, helps us make sense of Jesus' enigmatic statement, "This generation will certainly not take place," or "this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place." Let me read that again. Verse 30, you see that there? "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place." Now, atheists love that passage. They love that passage. You know why? Because if everything that Jesus was talking about was about His second coming, and Jesus is saying all these things will take place within your lifetime, then His prediction was wrong. Right? Now, there are some who would sit there and say, well, this generation is not in reference to the original audience. This generation is in reference to a future generation down the road who will bear witness to the reestablishment of Israel. And so they would say, it's the generation of 1948 who saw Israel be reintroduced as a nation. It's that generation that Jesus is talking about. But the problem with that is that generation's dead now. And so those who hold that position have went back and said, well, it wasn't those who saw it, it was those who was born in that generation. Okay, so we backpedaled. And by the way, grammatically speaking, anytime this phrase, "this generation," is used, it's always, without exception, used in reference to Jesus' contemporaries. And so, when He says all these things, what generation is Jesus talking about? The generation to whom Jesus is directly speaking. Isn't that the more natural feeling of the text? And what things will take place? All the signs that were already discussed and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Because that's the question they're asking, right? Isn't that it makes no sense for them to inquire about the destruction of Jerusalem temple and then He's sitting there talking about something else completely. So, when answering the question, when will these things take place? Remember, that's what they asked. He said, all these things will take place within your generation's lifetime. He's not talking about His second coming here. He's giving them signs to anticipate the destruction of the Jewish temple, which will be a hard, difficult, almost apocalyptic time for them. And so they need to be on guard and be careful. And He answers their question as directly as He can. It will happen in this generation's lifetime. And when did it happen? If this took place around 33 AD, this is right, the final week of Jesus. Most scholars believe He died around 30 to 34 AD. And then the destruction of the Jerusalem temple occurred in 70 AD. And this gospel was probably written around 50-ish, 60-ish AD. See, my interpretation holds to the miraculous prediction of Jesus, foretelling the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Now, I'm not saying that my interpretation, and again, this is just a generic overview of this passage so far. I'm not addressing all the verses in here. I can at a later time for you, but if I was to do a sermon on the Olivet Discourse, it would take months. It really would. And so again, what signs will precede the destruction of the Jewish temple? Various forms of persecution, the abomination of desolation, false messiahs, the Son of Man coming in judgment, the sending of the angels to go and gather the elect. All of these things are supposed to take place prior to the destruction of the temple, which will occur in that generation. With me so far? Yep. All right. But that's not the only question they asked. They did ask questions about the coming, your coming. What about you? Now again, a lot of people's like, well, the disciples are asking about when is Jesus going to return after He goes away. Let me ask you something. At this point, are they even aware that Jesus is going away? Do you think they have a systematic understanding of the end times like we do at this point? Jesus hasn't even revealed to them yet that He's going away. When does that occur? The Lord's Supper. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And it broke their heart. They were shocked and saddened. They never even heard. At this point, they're still grasping with this death that He's prophesying and this resurrection. And now going away? And so they're not asking the question as clear as we are. They're not sitting there saying, all right, Jesus, when you leave for an extended amount of time, what are the signs to look for when you come back? They're not thinking that way when they're asking this question. But I would argue that He does address those issues in a roundabout way. So what signs will precede your coming? Now, verse 32, all right? So verses 1 through 31 have been primarily about the destruction of the Jewish temple. Now, even grammatically speaking, it seems like now he's switching gears. Now in reference to perhaps their other questions pertaining to His second coming. And by the way, I think when they asked about His second coming, what they really meant is, when are you going to restore everything? When are you going to make everything great? And so they even addressed that in the book of Acts, remember? Even after the resurrection of Jesus, and they're talking to the resurrected Jesus, they sit there and say, is it now time for you to restore Israel? They're still a little confused about things. So, I believe with verse 32 to the very end, he is now addressing their second question pertaining to His glorious return, in which He makes all things new. He embarrassingly claims ignorance. You notice that? Does Jesus know the day or hour in which He's going to return? No. We don't have to be embarrassed by that text. The Son of God does not know the day or hour. This is something only the Father knows. Now, how can we make sense of this difficult passage? I thought Jesus was God, and by definition, God is all-knowing, right? Well, prior to Jesus' incarnation, that is, His appearing in the world as the God-man, it was decided within the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that the Son would humble Himself by adding humanity to Himself. And in doing so, that means that Jesus, while on earth, willingly refrained from His divine abilities, such as omniscience, or that is, the ability to know all things. Now, Jesus is not saying He lacks the ability to know. Rather, I think He is saying He willingly chooses not to know. All right? Now, just because someone chooses not to act upon their power does not mean that they're weak. Jesus allowed Himself to be arrested, correct? Now, what did He say? He said, if I wanted to, I have the ability to call down legions of angels to protect me. But He didn't. But because He chose not to, does not mean He doesn't have the capability to do so. So it is, if that's true, that we can think of Jesus not using His omnipotence, that is His power, we can also think of scenarios where He doesn't choose to operate within His omniscience, that is His ability to know all things. I don't know why we're stumped by this. I thought He was God. How can He not know something? But we're okay with a God dying. Which is more confusing. I thought He was God. How could He die? See, we seem to be okay with that, but the idea of Him choosing not to know something, which, by the way, is a display of power. Who here has the capability not to know something that they already know? Me neither. There's lots of things I wish I could just suck out of my mind and forget about. But I don't have that power. Jesus does. So here it is. Since the Son does not know when that day and hour is going to occur, that means the rest of us do not know. I'm sorry, John Hagee. I'm sorry, all these TBN producers and all these evangelists online sitting there saying, if you look at this sign and cross-reference it with this number and this eclipse and this thing and everything, you're not going to be able to predict the return of Jesus. Not even close. In fact, anytime they do make a prediction and they set a date, that's when I know He's not going to return. I remember being at Clear Creek Baptist Bible College. They had a free table in the student lounge, and one of the books that was there was 88 Reasons Why Jesus Was Coming Back in 1988. Now, I went to school there between 2002 and 2006. I think that guy got it wrong. So, the question we have to ask ourselves, what about signs? Are there signs that we can anticipate? Now, if I'm correct in my interpretation that everything between 1 to 31 is about the destruction of the Jewish temple, and 32 to the end of the chapter is about His glorious second coming, what signs does He give? The answer is none. None. Now, I know that might be like, well, wait a minute. I know that so-and-so said this is the way that you can look at all these things. I know that there's this Jewish algorithm, or there's this neat little calculation that we can get pretty darn close. Or didn't you see what happened over in Israel? Didn't you see what happened over in Russia? Didn't you hear about that weird plague? Didn't you hear about that earthquake? Didn't you hear about all these things? Jesus says there are no signs. None. In fact, He says, and cross-references with Matthew 24 as well, His day and hour comes across as a surprise to people. People are shocked by it. In Matthew 24, He says it's comparable to the days of Noah, He says. And in the days of Noah, He said people were just giving into marriage, going to work, doing their everyday normal life, that is until the rains came. And then one person was walking up the hill, one was taken, one was left standing still, two people working at the grindstone, one was taken, one was left behind. And by the way, that's not a reference to a rapture. It's not. Because if the second coming of Jesus is like the days of Noah, who was taken out in the days of Noah? The good people or the wicked people? Wicked people. And so it is with the second coming of Jesus. Who's left behind? Who was taken out? The wicked people, right? If it's comparable to the days of Noah. Anyway, I digress. And so, we are not commanded anywhere by Scripture to sit around and attempt to decipher the approximate time of His return. In fact, that's even what the angels said to the disciples when they asked, Jesus said to the disciples when they asked, is it now time to restore Israel? It's not for you to know, is what He says. Our responsibility is to be on the alert. Since we do not know when it's going to happen, we always need to be on guard and vigilant. In the Gospels, every illustration about His return is to exhort watchfulness and expected suddenness. The servant, and this is how it concludes here, the servant caught off guard by his master's sudden return. Whoa, when did you get here? People in the days of Noah were surprised by the flood. Matthew 24, 36 through 42. And by the way, that's from the Olivet Discourse, just in the Gospel of Matthew. Homeowner who was not prepared for the thief. Matthew 24, 43 through 44. Do thieves give signs? My house has been broken into. And that jerk didn't have the courtesy to give me a warning. He could have wrote me a letter. Dear Millers, I anticipate to rob you blind on the date of blah, blah, blah. Be on the alert. I am on my way to take all your prized possessions. Sincerely, your beloved neighborhood thief. You know, he didn't do that for me. You know what happened? I came home and my front door was open and my house had been looted. I had no idea. No idea. The parable of the 10 virgins. Parable of the 10 virgins doesn't teach you that Jesus is going to return suddenly or soon. In fact, it says be prepared for a long wait. And they did not prepare for a long wait. They ran out of oil, didn't they? The parable of the talents. Those who are given, and all this, by the way, is following the Olivet Discourse. This is Matthew 24:25. All these parables have to do with the second coming of Jesus. The parable of the talents. The guy who did not take the talents that his master left in his care and multiplied it. So Paul even urges his readers to remain vigilant daily and be prepared by living self-controlled lifestyle. I will quote him at length. 1 Thessalonians 5:1-11 says this. About the times and seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need anything to be written to you, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. What? Thieves don't give signs, folks. When they say peace and security, and then sudden destruction will come upon them, like labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you, brothers and sisters, are not in the dark, for this day to surprise you like a thief. For you're all children of light. You're all children of light and children of day. We do not belong to the night or of the darkness. So then, let us not sleep like the rest, but let us stay awake and be self-controlled. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be self-controlled and put on the armor of faith and love and a helmet of the hope of salvation. For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with Him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up as you are already doing. And so throughout this, he's saying we're not going to be caught off guard because we're always constantly waiting. We're always watching. We're always prepared. And we're living a simple, sober life of purity so as not to be caught off guard by our Master's sudden return. So to summarize, Jesus provides signs to disciples to help them be prepared for the loss of their temple. It will be hard and chaotic, but it is necessary to both bring about judgment on Jerusalem and to conclude the Old Covenant. Jesus also warns his disciples that his second coming is both unpredictable and unknowable. They are to be alert and never drop their guard. He is coming to bring reward and retribution. Now, just to conclude this sermon, I want to talk about several points of application because a lot of times people fail to see the connection with end times discussions with how they live now. But I've often said this, what you believe about tomorrow will impact how you live today. If you believe that the next time you went to get a lottery ticket, you're going to win $1 billion, you will change your life accordingly in anticipation of that event, right? And so it is with Jesus' return. Here are some biblical principles pertaining to the future that we are to faithfully live out. Number one, the future is to stir our strategy, how we live, how we do our calendars, how we conduct ourselves. Everything, every decision that we make should be in light of the fact that Jesus Christ is returning. And if this does not somehow help you be better prepared for that day, you are wasting your time. Second, the future is to stir our faith, because it is our job while He is gone to remain faithful. That we have to keep trusting in this future event that we have not seen, about a man that we have not met. And so this really stirs our faith. Number three, the future is to stir our mission. Deacon Jim already talked about how there's nations where there's only 4% of the population who are Christian. And you might be like, well, that's crazy. I never heard such a place. Well, I hate to tell you this, Meade County is about 15% Christian. 4%. Well, no, there's a church in every corner. Yeah, that are not filled. Right? And so we want our brothers and sisters to be ready, our neighbors to be ready for the Lord's return, right? So we should be about the mission to make disciples of them. And stop wasting time because with each passing second, we're edging closer to the return of Jesus. The future is to stir our hope. Hope. You understand that? No matter what you are going through, life circumstances, challenges. Doesn't matter what Fox News, CNN, or any of those outlets like to tell you about how things are progressively getting worse and it's just scary and so forth. Jesus Christ is returning and will make all things new. All things new. There is no reason for Christians to ever speak of fear. Ever. Then lastly, the future is to stir our decision. Our decision to follow Christ. Now is the day you need to make the decision. And to ask yourself, am I really prepared for Christ and His return? Or am I going to be like all these knuckleheads mentioned in Jesus' parables who were caught off guard, were surprised? Maybe you're here this morning playing church, going through the motions of church, that you just like going to church because it gives you that nice community feel, or it's just nostalgic for you, it's just the way you were brought up, but you never ever had a true relationship with Jesus. Listen, the coming of Jesus is comparable to the days of Noah. That there will be a day where it will be too late, the ark will be filled, and God Himself closed the door on that ark, meaning there was no one else who was going to get in on it. And so you keep pushing off, saying, well, I got time. My friend, you do not know the day or hour when Christ will return. And so you need to make that decision now. Not an hour from now, not tomorrow setting up an appointment with Pastor. Now, you need to make sure that you're on the right side of Jesus' return, because He will be coming, distributing rewards and also retribution, rewarding those who are good and faithful and waging war against the wicked. And if you are outside of Christ, you are classified as wicked, and He will wage war against you. Now, you need to follow Jesus. And so Miss Roxanne's going to help us out. We're going to sing a couple of verses in which you take the time to allow the Spirit to really evaluate your heart to determine whether or not you're prepared for the future. And the future is Jesus. Okay? Ms. Roxanne?
Would you stand, please?